It's a great pleasure to introduce Ignasi Grau. Ignasi serves as the General Director of OIDEL. I would call Karen up to come and check my French pronunciation, but I think I lost it around after Liberté. So I'm going to let Ignasi do the introduction there. OIDEL is a non-governmental organization specializing in the right to education and freedom of education, and Ignasi has been instrumental in advancing educational freedom globally. OIDEL advocates for the protection and promotion of education rights, emphasizing the importance of aligning educational projects with family values in increasingly pluralistic societies. Ignasi has a very hard and difficult job because he's engaged particularly with international organizations at the UN, and so we're going to, and perhaps, unless Ignasi covers it, we'll also maybe ask something about what that means and what those structures are. And I think I was through Ignasi's invitation, I was actually at an academic freedom presentation being done by one of the Ignasi will give me the correct word, but it was relating to, it was one of the UN organs. It was quite striking to me in that interaction was how was on the one hand, and I think this is a very challenging environment, because on the one hand you have people who are dealing with issues like, the army in a particular state coming into a university and grabbing professors and taking them away. So it's important to remember kind of where you are in the scale. But at the same time, there was a lot of discussion, particularly in developed about the situation in developed countries and academic freedom in developed countries. And then at the same time, sort of in the same day, my kids came back, and the idea was really that there was arguments about academic freedom, particularly of professors being, particularly of the academics being under siege in a sense. And then my kids who were at university came back that day and said how a friend of theirs had to modify his presentation sort of on the fly and his argument in class, because it became very apparent to me, if he continued arguing along a particular line, that he would not be admitted to his masters. So the big, very challenging kind of environment which Ignasi has to navigate. So thank you very much, Ignasi.
Good morning. Thank you so much. My pleasure. Can we connect the computer, or otherwise it's okay? That's for the microphone. Perfect. Sorry. Perfect. Terrific. So we are going to talk about, I don't know if I should grab that. I'm going to keep it like that. Okay. So we are going to talk today about freedom of education. Thank you for the invitation. First time in South Africa, so real honor being here. And what I want to talk about today is the scopes and limits of freedom of education. This is a word: freedom of education, educational pluralism, school choice, I don't know, you name it. But this is the same discussion you are having here. Is a discussion that it's happening in many other parts of the world. Somehow that's why OIDEL decided to exist, because they know that the international dimension of this discussion. And what I want to do today is to introduce you of how the right to education and their freedom dimension is shaped from an international perspective. Is there a way to pass that to the following one, or? Okay, so next one. So what is OIDEL? Just so you have OIDEL is about to celebrate its 4th anniversary, and basically what we do is, as has been said, we do advocacy for educational pluralism in front of international organizations. That's why we are in Geneva, because that's where there is the Human Rights Council, and also we keep going to Paris, because that's where UNESCO is. Freedom of education, as you know, is a tense issue. That I did that at the beginning of the week, but you Google it I mean, and that's one of the reasons I'm traveling right now also to other parts of the world, because the same tensions that you are dealing in South Africa are tensions live in many other parts. This very week I was in Norway. The week before I was in Paris. And so these sorts of the same discussions you are having here are happening in many other places. Next one, sorry. And however, there is good news. I mean, I'm just gonna, before starting to talk about the scopes and the limits, like we publish every 5 years more or less, the Freedom of Education Index, in which we assess the state of situation of 150 countries more or less on freedom of education in the world. And what we can see so far is the following thing. Next. Next, sorry. Despite the, I mean, one thing we see is that the tree makes more noise than a forest growing. And we see many tensions across the globe. However, in our indicator, we see that freedom of education generally continues growing around the globe. This is from 2002, 2016, and 2023. And when we assess countries using the same indicator, the trends are more positive than negative. Also, next, please. Also, we see that the number of parents attending to non-governmental options has grown in all regions except one, which is also tells us something about the state of situation of freedom of education. And when we see homeschooling, next please. When we see homeschooling, at this point, we see that 43%, we are going to hear more about that tomorrow with Peter, but 43% of countries today recognize homeschooling as a valid option. While this is happening, also what we can say is that there is growing tensions around this topic. Before, maybe there were less countries recognizing that explicitly. However, homeschooling or home education was not part of the political discussions, and it was not a source of polarization. So, freedom of education, where are we? Next, please. Next. In order we can have a good scope of the legal elements of freedom of education, we are going to see two parts. As I have a tendency to speak quickly, that do not hesitate to stop me. If eventually you got lost and you want to reconnect to my talk, here is what I'm going to devote most of my time. I'm going to talk about the right to education, what is the DNA, what is the basics of the right to education, and when we talk about minimum requirements in the field of the right to education, what are we actually talking about? Next, please. So, the right to education and its elements. Is it a human right? And specifically, is educational pluralism a human right? Like many times when we hear about freedom of education, people talk about that as, well, yeah, parents can choose, but this is not within the DNA of the right to education. But is it? All the documents I'm going to share with you are documents that are ratified, are signed and ratified by South Africa. So these are documents that are relevant, or should be relevant, in theory, for your national politics. So let's just start with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm gonna take all what we are going to see are UN documents. Okay? So Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let me put you some context about that. Okay? Oh, sorry. Can we go to the next one? I keep forgetting that. Can we see the next one, please? The next one? Okay, perfect. So, Universal Declarations of Human Rights. So, after the Second World War, you know, the international community realized we did something wrong and we need a document in which we can protect the dignity of the human beings. The difference between human rights and common rights, it's like human rights are there to protect dignity, therefore you cannot freely dispose them, freely say like, you know, you have a right to property and you can sell it, while right to education together with other rights, like right to life. You cannot sell an organ, or you cannot sell your body. Or if you do, you cannot do it based on human rights. You can do it based on other premises. So, in the first draft of the Human Rights Declaration, there was only one article, and it was the first one. Everybody has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory, technical professional education shall be made generally available, and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merits. The international community start having the second reading of that text, and then the Jewish raise their hand and they say that we had that already in Germany, and it didn't change anything for us. I mean, this thing could be applied for a dictatorship and not grant any dignity. Therefore, what they decided is like, we have to include the second article, and they include a name of the right to education. They say education is not just to prepare professionals, it's not a social tool. So they put the following article: education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. So the main aim of the right to education is the full development of the human personality. Next question they have is like, wait, how are we agreeing on what is essential for the full development of the human personality? And who is the actor responsible for that? And after a couple of talkings, the Netherlands raise their hands and they say, listen, for a long time, we in the Netherlands, we had this problem in the 19th century due to religion fights, and we end up this discussion by acknowledging parents as the first responsible of the education of their children. And that's why they include the third article. Can we go to the next one, please? Which is parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. However, well, no. Okay, so here, as you can see, the right to, next one, please. The next one. The right to education has three dimensions. One is the universal access, the second one is the individual development, and the third is parents' rights to choose. One of the challenges we are having today in human rights discussion is that people try to say that there is a hierarchy between these three dimensions. However, nothing coming from the discussions that happened at the time seem that this thing is accurate. If anything, the balance and the full realization of the right to education happens in the middle. Next one, please. Happens in the middle. So universal access and individual development without recognizing parental rights can be unequal, but also parental rights have to be balanced also with individual development and universal access. Okay, next one. Now is the question that you might raise if I'm not continuing, which is, wait, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights a binding document? No, it's not a binding document. That's why they decide to do the human rights treaties. So what is the scope of this right in binding documents? Next one, please. Next one. Okay, so 1948, getting into consensus was easy because, we just happened to leave the Second World War, and countries were aware that something needed to be done. But then when the treaties were already negotiated, that was Cold Time War. So it was more difficult to get a consensual document. That's why we have different international covenants talking about human rights. Specifically in this field, I think that is relevant. I'm going to talk about two. I might talk about some others after, but I want you to keep in mind two international covenants, both ratified by South Africa. So the first one is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that, as the name says, protects the civil and political rights, and that was especially pushed by the United States. And the other one is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, that was especially pushed by the USSR. At the time, the USSR didn't ratify the first one, and the US has never ratified the second one. So what do these covenants say about the right to education? The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in Article 18.4 says the following: the states to the present covenant undertake to have respect for the liberty of parents and, when applicable, legal guardians to ensure the religious and moral education. And according to this covenant, liberty of parents, freedom of education is especially critical to respect freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of conscience. The other covenant, next please. The other covenant has took the structure, more or less, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights we have seen. It changed a little bit the order. When they were negotiating this covenant, they say we have to put the aim of the right to education in the first paragraph, and they kept basically the same language. But then when they talk about freedom of education, the language has changed. So what have they put there? Well, first they have acknowledged that parents have the right to choose for their children other schools than those established by public authorities, and also acknowledge this freedom, that this has an special importance for religion and moral convictions, because that's one of the fields in which what a human being needs to fully develop, it's more likely to have disagreements. Some countries at the time were saying, well, we can do that, and through state-run schools. But then UNESCO saw that that wasn't right, and UNESCO said, listen, freedom of education without the state being the sole provider, that's like democracy in a one-party system. So we have to acknowledge also that the liberty of individuals and bodies to establish and direct educational institutions. Two things here that I think can be interesting. One, and critical. One, you might be what about homeschooling? Homeschooling at the time, as you know, this is a growing phenomenon. It always has existed, but this was not part of the conversation. So most of people, what they understand is like, this should be, and the special reporter, the UN special reporter, which is the highest ranked independent expert of the United Nations on the right to education, has said that homeschooling is an essential part of that. The second part, which is the one I'm going to talk after, as you see here, they include one sentence that is such minimum educational standards, like parents have parents within such minimum educational standards. We didn't have that before, and we don't have that in any other human right. That was one of the consensus, that's what some states asked to include here in order they could ratify this convention. And since then, this has been one of the major sources of conversation within international discussions on human rights. Next one, please. Then, as you know, there is the United Nations have a special agency on education, science, and culture. This is UNESCO, which is in Paris. And there is only one international treaty on the right to education, specifically talking about the right to education, which is the UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education. It's pretty much, the language in many senses is similar to the one that we have seen. And again, it recognizes the respect, the liberty of parents, firstly to choose for their children institutions other than those maintained by the public authorities. And again, it has included, but conforming to such minimum educational standards. Okay, let's talk then about, next please. Let's talk about this minimum requirement, these minimum educational standards. Sorry, next one please. Okay, do these requirements make sense? Like many times when we are talking, I'm talking with people about the right to education and freedom of education, they ask me, wait, let me do that here because I feel like I have been fighting with that for the last 5 minutes. So do these requirements make sense from a human rights perspective? Next one, please. Okay. So this is my niece, and I'm going to use her to explain why this might make sense. So the right to education is the right of the child. It's not the right of the parent. It's not the right of the father, it's not the right of the state, it's the right of the child. But you as homeschooling dads, you know, like the child have many difficulties to exercise their rights. And many times they don't know what is best for them. They will eat chocolate, many of them, in every meal. And examples like that could be done in many senses. So that's why there is a responsible for the exercise of these rights. And the responsible for that are the parents. The Convention of the Rights of the Child gives us a good framework for that. It says, states parties shall respect the responsibilities, rights, and duties of parents to provide in a manner consistent with the evolving capacities of the child, appropriate direction and guidance in the exercise of the rights by the child of the rights recognized in the present convention. So what we see here is, in one hand, the children who has rights, parents who is the responsible, especially regarding issues that we cannot have consensus, and then there is the state as a guarantor. So the state have here the responsibility of establishing a human rights framework in which parents can operate their rights. It's like the police, like the city. We decide like, okay, parents have responsible, and also at some point we have to make sure that they cannot use this responsibility in a way that it's against children's rights. Also important, you see this yellow sphere? This yellow sphere grows and the green sphere becomes smaller as far as the rights of the child, as far as children become older, you know, as far as they are more aware of their capabilities, the idea is parents became less and less responsible. Nothing I'm discovering you, because you are experimenting that in daily basis, but from a human rights perspective, that's also the way it's perceived. So, are these minimum requirements defined? Sorry, next one. We were talking before about being deeper connected. I'm the worst at that. So I have that, and sometimes I think you are following me, but maybe you are following me, but you don't see the same things I'm seeing. So are these minimum requirements defined in international legal binding documents? And that's where it gets tricky. Until now, most of us, we can say like, well, we are sort of agree with that, but what are these minimum requirements? And from an international perspective of legal documents that South Africa has ratified, are these minimum requirements defined? Let's see. Short answer, next. Yes, but not much. Yes, but not much, okay? Let's see about, next one, please. Minimum requirements that can be imposed to parents based on hard law binding documents. So what do we see? This is what we can extract from the binding documents. And what we can see is that three dimensions that parents can, in the exercise of their responsibilities, parents can impose over children, according to binding documents. First is grant the main aim of the right to education, the full development of the human personality. So if parents, they have kids, but they bring them to work, or they don't teach them something that the police think is essential for the full development of the human personality, like they make them, they don't want them to learn maths. That could be something that the state could force parents to do, or could force children to learn. Second, that this is not contrary to human rights and fundamental freedoms. So this responsibility of parents cannot be exercised in order to overcome things that are, that are against human rights. And here we're talking about content, so the content cannot be directly against human rights or fundamental freedoms, or we are talking about the way this is provided. And third, child integrity and well-being, which also could be included in the other two spheres. Yeah, you were saying? Yeah. Oh, do you want me to develop on the well-being? Oh, this is this is a summary, like if we take most of the covenants and we make a summary of like things that are stated there, that's dimensions these are dimensions that are, yeah, it's a copy-paste basically of international declarations when talking about human rights and children. So we can see these three things in Article 18 of the International Convention on the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and also in the Convention on the Rights of the Children. This will be... But as you can see, maybe we're going to start talking, and maybe not with me, but with other actors, many of the points that we see here, maybe we would not agree. Like what is the essentials for the full development of the human personality, especially, or what are the human rights? Well, human rights should be agreed because they are in international binding documents and also in our constitutions, but still there can be some sort of disagreement. So here is where we talk. Can we go to the next one, please? So maybe this is not enough, and here is where the soft law documents get into, I mean, they play their role. So binding documents of the United Nations are the ones we have seen until now. However, all the international treaties have a committee, and the aim of the committee is to help countries, support countries on the realization of these rights, and also the committees can develop comments, general observations on how these rights should be implemented. These are not binding documents, so these are open to discussion, but they can shed light on what we just have seen. So let's see what they have to say. Next one, please. Next one. Okay. So from the documents produced by human rights committees, that are the ones that are taking a look to these to these treaties, we can have these conclusions, more or less. States can, actually they must, establish a clear legal framework in which different social initiatives can flourish. And there is like three things that should be part of this legal framework that it should be based on human rights: the scope, content, and form. Let's talk about the scope. According to covenants, according to these committees, there are three dimensions. The scope of this legal framework should focus specifically in three dimensions: admissions, curriculum, and recognition of certificates, which somehow makes sense. Like you cannot, like, admissions in the sense that you cannot discriminate people from certain sorts of education. Also, curriculum, there is certain content that the police as take and think like, listen, if we want to live together we should learn that. And then recognition of certificates, like how people are having access to university, or if someone appeared to one country, how are we making sure that what he knew there is also valid here? Let's talk about content. We have seen that a little bit, but content, what these committees have said is that the content has to be in line with the full development of the human personality and the sense of dignity. More specifically, the committee has said, and this is not here, the essential learning tools should be literacy, oral expression, numeracy, problem solving, and the basic, and also skills, values, and attitudes. It's still general, but it gives us also a more concrete scope. Also, it should enable all persons to effectively participate in a free society. So, going to alternatives to the school education should not be an excuse to isolate children from enabling them to be free, responsible citizens. And finally, the promotion and understanding of tolerance and friendship among all nations. So education freedom of education is not an excuse to promote intolerance. And then form. Many of these things are on the top of your head can come easily, but the form of education has to be respectful with physical dignity of the child. We have seen that before. So also the respect of the child should be respectful with the cultural identity, language, and values. This is also something that worked for the states. So actually, sometimes we use that as an argument in favor of parental rights. Like we say, the state don't have the capacity to educate their kids in a manner respectful according to their identity, values, and language. So parents usually also are more sensitive to this dimension. Also, some essential materials, like parents should have access and in their education to some essential materials, and here it's buildings, sanitation facilities, drinking water, some source of training, then the competitive salaries, and it's more for independent schools. And finally, education has to be ensured in a safe and healthy environment. That would be what this clear framework should include, according to international conversation. And then next. Well, okay, and is this it? So one of the problems we can, now it's where it gets tricky, like one of the problems we are seeing lately is that the scope of many of these things are sources of debates. And here's what this is growing, I think, unreasonable minimum requirements that we have observed lately. So some states are saying, listen, the way this state is fulfilling their obligations is through mandatory scholarization. This, as we can see, this is not stated in an international covenant, nor in the recommendations of the committees. However, there are countries that are trying to include that within these discussions. Second, content. So content, I think this is going to be the growing discussion within minimum requirements. Mandatory content that, and not only for homeschoolers, also for independent schools. And we are seeing a growing, when we did this report, we asked experts from all around the world that were helping to understand the situation of their countries. What do you think is going to be the challenge for freedom of education in 5 years? And they all say curriculum. In terms of content, in countries like South Africa, I think it's going to be the issue of comprehensive sexual education. What we see of minorities in other parts of the world is like that religious minorities won't be able to have freedom because we see, like, especially in countries of the Middle East, that there is more and more impositions in their curriculums on the majority religion of this area. And then the last thing is form. We are seeing that people are putting more restrictions because they are saying, if we have a plural system, we will have less social cohesion. Next one, please. Using the data of this report, we have crossed the data of this report with some indicators of social cohesion. And what we have realized is that blaming educational pluralism with the lack of social cohesion is like blaming educational pluralism of the lack of dolphins in a country. Like, there is no relation on that. Like, the gap, in many senses, like countries that are, you can assess it in different ways, but if that was the case, that would mean like countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, and Ireland would be countries that would be broken. And it's not the case. In the same hand, what we are seeing is like many times people are against freedom of education in the different manners because they are saying that countries where there is a plurality of actors providing education, immigrants are more likely to feel part of the society, but the migrants gap indicator, when we cross it with freedom of education, we just see the opposite. And we can talk more about that, but I think this is going to be an issue. This is an issue in many countries. I'm thinking, for instance, France, Portugal, but there is a strong argument to make a case against that. So this part you don't have it anymore, but anyway, just I think, and I want to finish with that because I think it's an important part. As you see, a big part of the minimum requirements is what do we understand, like all citizens should understand in a society. And I think one of the challenges of actors advocating for freedom of education, and that includes you, but it also includes like people advocating for independent school, for private schools, you name it, is what should be these minimum requirements. Education, in a way, is what we are negotiating and what we are talking when we talk about education, and you know it as parents, is what's worthy of this world that I want to pass to the next generation, so they can transform it. They can this happens at a micro level, at the family, but also it happens at a macro level. And you have to think like states, communities, at one point they also think like, listen, if we want to succeed for the next generation, we have to pass some content. Focusing all the energy also on the rights of the families and ignoring also what do we think is the common content, it's dangerous. And many times like we are just really concerned about protecting our own garden while the forest is growing behind the fence and it will come to our garden. So I think it's important that if you want to make sure that these minimum requirements do not put in jeopardy your own rights, these are conversations that you have to be involved as well. And I think I will leave it here because we will continue talking after, right? Yeah. So yeah.
Can I just get a mic for the audience, perhaps? Because I think, Ignasi, thank you very much. That was very interesting. and you've also given us some time, so we'll actually take a few questions. I wanted to ask you, maybe I'll ask a sort of slightly technical question first relating to your presentation. You spoke about scholarization. Can you just explain that term?
Well, scholarization is that the only way that this right can be exercised, if you want to use it, can be within formal facilities, like within a formal school. Therefore, if within the scope of the right to education there is mandatory scholarization, homeschooling would not be an option. This has been, I mean, as far as I know, this hasn't been, I mean, it hasn't been the conversation so far here, but in countries like my own country in Spain, that's where we are now. Like they say the full realization of the right to education only can happen within formal education. Therefore, homeschooling is banned.
Thanks. It's not that I'm not worried about COVID, I'm just worried about the mics interacting, so that's why I'm standing away from you. A second question is, we see all the time in the papers these kind of statements like, UN declares three-headed aliens will now rule the earth. And it's often not clear who the UN is. And if you dig into that, you find, oh wait, this is something issued by a body that maybe has observer status. You've spoken, I think you've spoken about what are binding treaties and are not binding treaties, but can you maybe explain the structure of the UN? And that I think also makes people very angry because they're saying, now why is the UN telling us that the three-headed aliens are going to rule? But it actually turns out that that's this body with observer status called Society for the Promotion of the Rule of Three-Headed Aliens.
Oh, thank you. That's a really good question. So, you remember Ban Ki-moon? He was the Secretary General of the UN. Now it's Guterres. They asked him once, Ban Ki-moon, like, who is your boss? And he said, I have 100, I don't know how many countries there were at the time, but 180 bosses. Basically, the bosses of the UN is just, the UN is a bureaucratic structure that enables the states to have a platform to talk about the issues they are interested. Human rights is one of these issues, but not the only ones, you know, also security and social issues. But the UN is not a super government. It's a structure that enables countries to talk. In this regard, the only binding documents are from a human rights perspective, the only human rights documents that are binding are the treaties. Other than that, it can shed light, it can inspire jurisprudence, it can inspire laws, not binding. So if someone comes and says, hey, I have, let's say, I have a general comment of a committee talking about the right to education that says that, I'm just making this case, that homeschooling is banned. You can say, oh, all right, that's good. We can, I mean, it's our prerogative to take that into consideration or not, but that is not binding. It can, what the tricky part is like in international law, when something has been repeated many times and implemented, it can become a custom and can be interpreted as law. But when you get to see this thing for the first time, you cut it by saying, okay, you can say that this is not binding. We did not let our sovereignty go for that because we didn't ratify anything. Therefore, we don't implement that. So that's one thing. And I think that's one of the challenges today in international discussions. Like, as you can see, the world is not in a moment in which reaching consensus is easy. And it doesn't seem it's going to be, I don't know, the history is fascinating, so anything can happen. But I would say in the next 5 years, at least, it will be really hard to have new treaties or changes in the treaties. So what is happening is like international actors that have their own agenda. Everybody have, I mean, that's not a bad thing. I have my own agenda. Everybody has your own agenda. When they cannot reach a consensus, they develop either, they do their advocacy in general comments, in the Agenda 2030 would be a good example. The Agenda 2030, it's a political document. It's not binding. You have to imagine like the Agenda 2030 has been accepted in a resolution by all of the countries. So when your country is trying, for instance, to impose something on the Agenda 2030, you have to think, wait, is Saudi Arabia also doing that? No, because this is, or is Iceland, are all the countries? No, why not? Because this is not a binding document. This is just set a group of recommendations, or it's a political agenda. And it's true that the states have committed to do that, but not in a way that with a treaty you should be able to go to a court. With the Agenda 2030, with a recommendation, you should not be able to go to a court. And that's what you have to bear in mind. However, whenever we discuss anything, this thing can have a strong impact. And I'm going to put you an example, okay? And I think that's why it's important, despite the fact that these things are not binding, these things have an important impact. Eventually, I mean, at one point, at the beginning of these discussions, people, someone, in one of these documents decide like, okay, we are going to call, if we have to make a division between educational policies, actors, we are going to call them private and public. And many other names could be put there. They could have saying like governmental, non-governmental, for-profit, non-for-profit, but they make this distinction. And then in many countries, every time they have had this discussion, now the distinction is private-public. Why? Because every time they have this discussion, there is a smart guy in the room that says, listen, the UN is using this terminology and they struggle a lot to find consensus. Why don't we use this terminology as well? So this can happen also in many other things. Also, one thing that can happen at the national level, you might be having a strong discussion on something. And the room many times after 30 minutes of discussion, again, there is a smart guy and says like, okay, why don't we base our first draft on this recommendation or in this document? And that can shape completely the conversation. So that's why it's important of being there. Because as I say many times, if you're not on the table, you are in the menu.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I just want to ask anyone who's online, if you have any questions, we've got a few more minutes, and we will also have a more extensive discussion at 12. But please feel free to put them on the Q&A, and we'll take some questions from the floor and then some questions from the Q&A. Are there any questions from the floor? There we are. Okay, go ahead. There's a multiplicity of mics. Prof. Cronje will enjoy that.
Thank you. My name is Milan. My question is, to what extent can these human rights be forced onto people who don't want it? You know, if the state comes to me and says, I have the right to live in the big city, and I say, I don't want to live in the big city, I'm happy in my rural town. And they say, no, you have to, it's your right, we must force it onto you. That is a problem, you know, and because this whole thing is done in the name of the child's right to education is used to decide what I may believe and what beliefs and values I may transfer to my children. And if the state says that the child, or if the human rights says that the child is the right holder, and the child says, I'm happy with my education, Now the state says, no, you're too young. You can't make that decision. Then the parents say, well, we are the closest to this child. We love our children. We sacrifice for them. We'll give our lives for our children. We have their best interests at heart. And we are feeling the consequences of whatever happens to them. We will manage it. And the state says, no, you can't. Our father moves from you. We don't know you. We don't care for you. We don't love you. We'll manage it. But we do it in the name of protecting your rights. I mean, how does the UN charters and things handle that?
I mean, yeah, this is a really good question. Here, I mean, first thing that it's important here to bear in mind is what I just share you, that's the binding things. This is the binding things. I mean, there is also the Convention of the Rights of the Child that introduced the best interest of the child. But I mentioned the Convention of the Rights of the Child for one reason, because that's what sets the framework of parents have responsibilities, rights, and duties. Yeah, the child have rights, but the child is not an isolated island. And I think that's what the Convention of the Rights of the Child is trying to tell us. Like the child is not an isolated island. And we can have many examples. Poor children, they share this problem with their family. A children belonging to a minority, they share their identity with their family. And you name it. A children coming from a religious family, they share this condition with this family. Many times when people are trying to make a caricature of this idea of the responsibilities, like the rights of parents due to their responsibility, they try to say that captures kids, you know, that jails kids into their own conception. But is it the case? I think that's what the human rights treaties have in their language, is in order to be able, you know, in order to be an active citizen, you have to know who you are. And that does not prevent you to change your mind. That enables you to go into the police, to go into the public square and negotiate who you want to be. But what minorities know is, like, if they don't know who they are, like if in that one ally we find many times in these conversations are indigenous people. Indigenous people, they hear neutrality and best interest of the child, and they say, we know what it means. It means, like, we put you in a room together with many kids, and then after 20 years, we don't remember who we are. And if we don't know who we are, like, it's really hard to know where you're going if you don't know where you come from. So what we need is, we need to know who we are. So who are the best actors to grant that? Are the parents. And this is the framework, I would say. And also, if this argument that some people are using, that if you give this responsibility to parents, you encapsulate children, well, we have seen the limits of that, but also we have seen that parents have limits in the exercise of their responsibilities. But also, if that was the case, I don't know, Spain would be the most Catholic country of the world, or Netherlands, because 40% of schools are Catholic. Nevertheless, what we are seeing is, like, we have less religious people. Like, receiving an education that is linked with your identity doesn't mean that it forces you to be that thing. It means that when you go out, you can negotiate from a concrete point of view, and there, you know, you can change negotiation with some premises. Otherwise, the hegemonic culture just vanishes the minority groups. And I'm saying, and going again to the first point, I think it's important to have that in mind, that what's binding and not it's binding. Because when someone comes to you and they say, listen, for the best interest of the child, we think they should learn that thing. Wait, who says that? You say that? A report says that? Because human rights, what we agree as a community, what we agree as international community, we just saw it. And what we agree as a national community, you know it better than I. But I think it's important to make these frameworks and acknowledging that, man, there are things that we are not going to agree. That's why we have this pluralism. And that doesn't make our democracy worse, that makes our democracy better. That's just the bottom line on that, like, there is a tendency now on many of these discussions to put in contradiction democracy and freedom of education. And I think freedom of education is one of the best indicators of democracy, because it shows us how states trust their citizens on passing values. You know which are the only 3 countries that do not acknowledge parental rights at all? North Korea, Cuba, and well, the third one, it's funny, but it's not, we wouldn't guess it, but it's Northern Macedonia. But you know, that tells us a lot of how important is this freedom in order to acknowledge, in order to protect also our democracy.
Any other questions from the audience?
Thank you very much for your answers so far. Building on this previous question and your answer, the subject of minimum standards comes up again and again, and your answer right now refers to pluralism. So my question is, and it always seems a bit vague, I never understand the answer, I never understand this properly. Who is going to be setting these minimum standards? Why should they be the ones chosen to do that? And have there been proper attempts to do this? Because as a parent, I find it a bit offensive that somebody sitting in an ivory tower somewhere thinks that they know the best for my children. If I am raising my own children, for instance, I have a minimum standard imposed upon myself that my children should be raised in my faith. That is a self-imposed, if you want, minimum standard, or a standard that I believe has been imposed upon me by the Lord, by God, upon myself and my wife to raise our children with. That's not a minimum standard that an education department bureaucrat is going to expect of me. They might expect that a minimum standard would be to raise my children in some sort of multi-faith approach. So the question really is, who determines these minimum standards? Have attempts been made to determine these standards in various places? And does it not contradict the pluralism that you've just been speaking of?
I think, I mean, we have a problem. I mean, this conversation didn't happen a long time ago. Why? Because we had pretty homogeneous societies. Maybe not in South Africa, but generally speaking, in most of countries, societies were quite homogeneous. So minimum requirements were I mean, they knew them. I'm thinking about the countries I usually go, and you know, white, like in the UK, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant conversations, and you name it, each country has these minimum requirements. This problem has become a thing at the moment where societies are more plural, which is not necessarily bad, but that forces us to know, what do we have in common? What do we, I think like the state as the, can you hear me well? Yeah.
Yeah, fine. Hearing you fine. I'm just checking.
The state as the mechanism that represents the voice of the people somehow have a responsibility to say, okay, let's establish at least what do we have in common that we should pass it from one generation to another. Maybe that's why we are talking about minimum requirements, not maximum requirements. At the time, these things could be really comprehensive. Maybe today these things should be really small. But that forces us to be part of this ongoing conversation. That forces us to be like, this is not one situation in which we say, okay, all set, this is the limit. No, I think the limit will move. It has been moving a lot the last years. And that's what I was saying before. Parents have rights because they have responsibilities. And specifically, it looks like from a religious and moral convictions, they have an area protected, but there is a lot of issues around that some actors are saying, I think all people should know that, or should be able to respect that, or should be aware of that. Here, the critical thing is that as civil society actors being there and say, listen, on this regard, we are not agreed, so maybe these minimum requirements are not that minimum. But this is an ongoing conversation, and I think this is one of the challenges in the years to come for actors advocating for freedom of education, to show people, listen, I mean, in a democratic society, maybe we don't have to have this knowledge. I mean, there is certain content that we don't agree, therefore this should not be minimum. Or the other way around also, like, I'm sure there are things that you could show that, hey, I would be for all children learning that. But okay, you are not agree, that's the same thing we see in the other side of the conversation. But this is not going to stop, this is going to continue, so I encourage you, like, be involved in these conversations and make sure that what's happened beside your garden, that be part of this conversation also, because otherwise these trees will end up by falling into your, I can't remember now the flowers we were saying before, but these South African lovely flowers we were saying before.
I think we'll close on that. There's a question for Prof. Cornea, which we'll do at the later session. I think answering Sean's question, and it's Sean Green, one of the trustees of the Pestalozzi Trust, who was asking that. I'm not too sure if you're aware of this case, Ignasi, but now 2 years ago, there was a case in Belgium. And as we've heard, Belgium, the Netherlands, are some of the most progressive countries in terms of freedom of education. A case was brought, and so essentially the education system in those countries, there are schools, but you could choose to, for example, send your children to a Catholic or a Calvinist school, for example, or a Montessori school, or any variety. So each of those, and those are funded by the state. And so what the state tried to do was the state tried to impose minimum standards on those schools. The case was taken to the Belgium Constitutional Court, and I think it's called the Superior Court. I can't remember the exact name of that court, but I think it's the Constitutional Court. And the state regulations were struck down. And one of the criteria, I won't go through all the details of the case, but one of the criteria of the case was they said there was no evidence of cooperation in setting these. So you have I think there's some elements of this case are peculiar because they're peculiar to the Dutch Constitution, the Belgian Constitution. But the argument that was made was that you cannot set these standards, the state cannot set to impose these standards independently. There must be, it's a cooperative endeavor. And I think another very important element of that case was the court found that the state couldn't then play a kind of clever game in which the state then says, okay, no, and this is said all the time in South Africa, just as long as you do all of these things, which will take up your whole day, you can then do whatever crazy other stuff you want to do afterwards. And the court said the minimum requirements must not be set in such a way that they completely limit, that then effectively they do away with the choice, with the plurality. So that's a very important case. We in South Africa, our constitution says that our courts can recognize foreign law, and certainly if that ever becomes an issue, it's a leading case with some leading reasoning that we would be able to rely on. So I think thank you very much, Ignasi, for... please go ahead.
No,
this is the problem with Iberians. We can never stop speaking.
No, just one thing. But within that, I think one of the main arguments against homeschooling in international conversations is that that they are not there. So when when there is not homeschooling actors, one thing we are trying to do in OIDEL is bringing these voices into international conversation. When there is no actors, you can say about them whatever they want. There is not a face. We can protect them, but freedom of education is huge, but they say homeschooling, they make a mockery out of that. That changed really rapidly when they see faces. And when they see faces, they see personal stories, and they see, okay, that's more real. To be part of that.
No, thank you. And I think that's almost the point that I was going to say. So I wanted to thank you for your work and the work that OIDEL does in bringing those voices forward. And as you know, you have our support. And one of the reasons to have this conference as well is to introduce you to our homeschooling community, which have been very, very effective at doing very much that. When we had the Basic Education Law Amendment Bill, when it went through Parliament, Parliament thought that this would be a very simple thing, very simple exercise, and homeschoolers came to actually dominate that conversation to the point that people were kind of saying, it's like, oh no, the homeschoolers are coming in here. And I think that began to change very rigid positions that had existed before. And that's obviously something that we want to take forward. So thank you very much for traveling all the way. We know that you're fitting us in between personal and work commitments, so thank you very much.